Yakuza games usually have a ton of substories, so much so that it's hard to believe that all of these events happen during a given game's time span, and for some games, they couldn't have taken place sometime after the main story. For example, in Yakuza 5, it doesn't really make sense that Kiryu is still living as Taichi Suzuki, and in Yakuza 6, Kiryu is supposed to be dead. So does that mean that all the substories are non-canon? Well, we know that in Yakuza 6, Kiryu mentions the baby substory from Yakuza 4. Also, I think some substories make the overall story more interesting. In Yakuza 1, there's the Yayoi Dojima substory. Not only is this where this character gets properly introduced and makes her appearance in Yakuza 2 less jarring, but this is also where Kiryu gets truly confronted for killing Dojima. Throughout the game's story, a bunch of people try to get revenge on Kiryu for killing the chairman, but it's fine, just beat him up and move on. But this substory shows how much taking the fall for Nishiki affected the people around him, and makes you think, did Kiryu make the right choice? Is it worth covering for Nishiki if Yayoi never finds out who killed her husband? In general, a lot of Yakuza 1's substories feel important. They introduce you to the world of Yakuza and Kamurocho's different locations. Some locations feel specifically made for certain substories. For example, I don't think you ever need to go to the strip club in Yakuza 1, which is kind of an iconic location, except for Yuya's substory, where you also get to know more about him, and feels in line with the Date and Flores subplots, which are part of the main story. Then in Yakuza 3 you have the iconic Darling the Eye substory, which really feels like it's part of the main story. I think most people agree that this substory is canon. It fleshes out Rikiya's character, and deepens the relationship between him and Kiryu, who went through the same thing. Also, it'd be really sad if Rikiya died without finishing his tattoo. No. This is a man who died without regrets. Even mundane substories like the fake Kiryu substory in Yakuza 2, which arguably doesn't add anything to the plot, are sometimes in line with the game's themes. Yakuza 2 is kind of about impersonation. Most characters are not who they seem, or are pretending to be someone they're not. Dajin Kim is pretending to be Yukio Terada, the Jingwon Mafia are disguised as regular people, there's the fake Kazuki, the one guy who worked for the florist who was actually evil. The final showdown is all about finding out who's the real dragon, because there can only be one dragon. So what I'm saying is, fake Kiryu and Ryuji are the same. I think we can agree that some substories have to be canon, or at least that some of them add to the overall experience. But how do we decide which substories actually happened? Well, here's my brilliant theory. If a substory has a cutscene, then it's canon. Genius. What do all the substories we've mentioned so far have in common? They all have full-fledged cutscenes, which is part of why they're so memorable and feel part of the main story. The Dojima substory, the fake Kiryu substory, the Rikiya substory, even the baby substory, which has to be canon. So while I was making this video, I found out that there's a mod that dots the eye on Rikiya's tattoo after a certain point in the story, which means that in the actual game his tattoo remains unfinished, even if you do the substory, which technically means that the dotting the eye substory didn't actually happen, and completely destroys my argument. Also, that would mean that the Kappa substory is canon, and the implications of that are terrifying, but let's just keep going with it. Even when there's no real argument for why some substories are canon, like for example the one in Yakuza 4 that ends with this amazing cutscene. Besides playing with the theme of what are people willing to do for money, which is a recurring thing in Yakuza 4, especially in Akiyama's part, but it would also be a shame to be like, hey, remember that scene where Akiyama burns a counterfeit bill? Didn't happen. It's like finding out that Broly isn't canon. But what about recurring characters that only appear during substories, like the Amon clan? Are they canon? Personally, I always thought that the Amon fights were non-canon. I feel like they're a little too fantastical, even for Yakuza. Also, I find it hard to believe that there's this super OP clan just hanging around, and nobody ever mentions them. I know they're supposed to be a secretive group, but still. Then again, in Infinite Wealth, Joramon does appear in the main story technically, but he just acts as a tutorial more than anything. And it's kind of debatable if these types of events actually happened. Did Ichiban actually spend 3 days on a remote island catching bugs? Kind of ruins the tension a little bit. But does that mean that all the substories after Yakuza 4 didn't happen, since they don't have cutscenes? What about the one in Yakuza 7, where Ichiban meets the ghost of a sick girl that heard him go to work every morning, which filled her with hope? Ichiban spent 18 years in prison, and it'd be understandable if he felt that he wasted his life. But this girl is here to remind him that he can bring joy to people's lives by just living and being himself. I think this substory adds a lot to Ichiban's character, and to the overall story. And I like to think that it's canon, even though it's also a bit fantastical. At the end of the day, there's no definitive answer as to which substories are canon or not. The whole substories with cutscenes are canon argument is just an easy way to look at things. But it's a bit restrictive. If you want to believe that ghosts are real, go ahead. If you think that aliens are going to be the main villain in Found Judgment, then don't let anybody stop you. Don't let your dreams be dreams. But if you're one of the people who believe that Kiryu had sex, then I'm afraid you're delusional, my friend.